Hi, everybody. Amy Torres here. And my guest today is Dr. Scott Kolbaba, who has touched my heart very deeply. And I think that you're going to be very interested in what he has to share because he is a physician and internist, and he will be talking about miracles that physicians have experienced in their practices and in their lives. In fact, he's written a riveting book called Physicians' Untold Stories: Miraculous Experiences Doctors Are Hesitant to Share with Their Patients or Anyone. Now, some of you who follow me are Course in Miracles students, and I know you can relate to the fact that the scribes of A Course in Miracles were prestigious psychologists, and they too did not want to share any kind of miracle secrets. They didn't want to share that this miraculous text and workbook and manual was coming through them at the time, because unfortunately it can compromise a doctor's reputation. But thankfully things have changed a lot in the last 50 years, and it's much more mainstream now to be able to actually share miracles that are occurring in our everyday lives. And it's so important so that you and I can feel like they're right here to be had. So I'm so pleased to have you, Scott. Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks, Amy. It's great to be here.
I was rereading your book last night. I read it through a couple of weeks ago, and then last night I was rereading, and I have to say that each time it brings tears to my eyes.
You know, Amy, sometimes I know I've written the stories, but sometimes when I reread them, I get the same impression. Some of these stories are very moving, and when I was writing them, in the middle of the night, many times, the tears would be going down my eyes, thinking, this is such an incredible story. I don't believe that I'm typing this. It was fun.
I love hearing you just very candidly say that you cried as you wrote. And in the book, you also talk about feeling that you were about to cry, not always joyfully. And I feel that it's so healing for us as a society, for men to cry.
I think it is too. I think it expresses emotion that many people have suppressed for a long time. And I think that's good to get out. And I think that's healing. And when I have people facing very serious conditions and death and so forth, crying, it can be very beneficial. And I've learned over the years not to try to suppress it, just to let people cry and get it out. And just be quiet for a little bit. That's one of the hardest things I think a doctor has to learn is to shut up and just be quiet and let people express themselves or express their emotions. And that's very healing, I think.
Oh, it moves me a lot to hear you say that, because my background as a psychotherapist, I too had to learn how to sit with people and give them the space to have their feelings without interrupting too soon, without sticking a box of tissues under their nose too soon.
Right.
Because even when you're on your deathbed, if you're crying, tears feel like life on your cheeks. So.
Yeah, and we're taught in our medical classes to let people have some quiet time and let them think. And it's very hard as a doctor. You want to step in and take charge and take over and help the person heal. But sometimes just being quiet for a long period of time can be very healing. And it brings out some emotions and some things that the people want to express that they may not have before.
Yeah, it probably is leading people right back to the essence from which miracles spring. And I know lots of people who are disillusioned with doctors, feel that doctors haven't come through for them. And that's another reason that I want you to talk about how when you spoke to 26 of your colleagues, and probably more, but 26 stories made it into your book,
Yes.
that you found over and over again that they were what you call, you use this really cute term. You said you are a card-carrying member as well of the Sappy Do-Gooders Club. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, I think that I use that just to be humorous, but that really is true. There are lots of things that I found about doctors when I interviewed these doctors, and I interviewed 200 doctors. And doctors don't talk about deep things. They talk about potassiums and the schedule for the gallbladder surgery the next day and things like that. But it's rare that doctors actually talk to anyone, including their colleagues, about deep matters. And I found when I talk with doctors that the overriding goal in their lives was to be a sappy do-gooder, to do good in the world, to help someone every single day, to try to do some good, to try to cure cancer, to try to help people get through this tough life, and to help in any way that they can. And when we first apply to medical school, we always write an essay. Most doctors have to write an essay for medical schools about why they wanted to become a doctor and so forth. And you put all kinds of flowery things in there and some sappy things about how you want to, be a kind person, help other people. But I found that doctors that had very gray hair, that had been in practice for many, many years, still had exactly the same goal: to help people every single day. And it became such a recurrent theme that I finally called them sappy do-gooders, just to get some humor into that. And it's really true. And I discovered that most doctors really are trying to do some good in the world. And it's very encouraging and very uplifting to me to see that. And I think, Amy, that was one of the reasons that they share these stories. These are stories that can be embarrassing, to talk about a dream that you had about a patient, to talk about a vision that you had of someone that had passed. Things like that can be embarrassing to say. And the doctors, I'm sure, I know that they were concerned about having their practice suffer for sharing some of these stories. But their overarching goal was to do some good in the world. And they recognized that they told these stories, people would be helped. People would get, would believe again in something. They would have hope again. And I think that's why they shared these stories, because even though they were concerned about the risks of their practice, they felt that these stories would do some good in the world, and that's why they shared them. No question in my mind.
Isn't it interesting that it can be embarrassing to speak of these things, especially as a doctor when you're supposed to come from a science background, and yet you discovered that most doctors, yourself included, valued your families above all else. And family values usually include some kind of religious or spiritual belief. And therefore, having a vision or having a dream would only be a testament to our faith. But
Yes.
can you speak to that?
Sure. Most of the doctors that I talk with were relatively spiritual, especially after some of these experiences. But only about half were really religious. Half went to church. Half had an organized religion. Many did not at all. And after these experiences, most of them realized there was something else out there, and they had a very deep, abiding belief that there's something else. Most called it this force, God, but others did not. And
what did they call it? I didn't quite catch that.
God, or some called it universe, or a universal force, or something.
Oh, yes. So some call this force God. Some call it the universe. Some
Right.
people call it higher intelligence, higher power. Mm-hmm.
Right. So they all had that very deep belief, and I think that's what led them to want to share these stories, because they wanted other people that had no hope to have hope, that there is something else out there. There's something that loves us unconditionally, that helps us in our day-to-day life. And if you look back in retrospect, many times we'll see that through our lives, there's been a guiding hand that has introduced us to the right individual at the right time, or we happened to bump into someone in the elevator that we thought was a coincidence, but it may not have been. It may have been this, in retrospect, this guiding hand that helped us achieve the goals that we wanted to achieve. So,
absolutely. And most of my viewers know that experience firsthand, as do I. Now, you tell some amazing stories in the book. Would you share a story with us? Maybe one that illustrates this point or stands out for you?
Sure. Let's see. There's some interesting stories. Let me tell one that I like particularly. The Steve Heim story. Steve Heim's a physician that doesn't have an organized religion, is I think very spiritual, but you wouldn't know it if you just were talking to him. And he had an experience in Colorado while he was skiing with his wife and his wife's sister. They were skiing down a mountain when a sudden blizzard hit. And the blizzard dropped the temperature. The snow was coming down. They could hardly see anything in front of them, but they had to ski down the mountain. They came to a patch of trees, the pine trees, and they had to go to the right or the left. And the girls went to the left, and Steve thought they were all going to the right and went to the right. And they, as soon as he realized that they were separated, he decided to ski back through the pine trees and get to the girls who were waiting for him on the other side.
And I'm remembering this story now, and I believe he wrote in that anecdote that he knew that to go back up and join them didn't make sense. Well, something in him knew, like, logically, maybe I should keep going down, but still he felt drawn to go back up. Am I getting that right?
He suddenly had this overwhelming feeling that something was significant that he had to do. And he didn't know what it was, but he had a feeling of dread that there was something very bad happening, and he was being called on to do something about it. And he didn't know what to do. So as he's skiing through the grove of trees to where the girls were waiting for him, he decided to stop skiing. He had no idea why he wanted to stop skiing, but he just stopped skiing, took his skis off and stood there for a minute trying to decide what to do. Everything became quiet and silent. Despite the wind blowing and the snow coming down and the temperature dropping, it was silent. He could hear himself breathe. He could hear the crunch of snow under his boots. And he decided to then take his skis off and climb up the mountain in the opposite direction from where the girls were waiting for him. He had no idea why he's doing that. He's climbing and walking and climbing and walking. He felt an overwhelming urge to do this. And he couldn't stop himself. And he came to a large pine tree about 100 feet from where he'd stopped skiing. And there's a well that goes down to the base of the tree from the side, from 5 feet of snow down to the base. And he looked down, and as soon as he looked down, he realized why he was there. There under the tree was a body covered with snow. Individual must have hit the tree and then was underneath the tree. And had he not came upon him, they probably wouldn't have found him till the next spring because the snow was covering him already. Well, he's a trauma surgeon. What better person to happen by coincidence to find this individual?
Quote unquote coincidence.
Yes. So he brushed off the snow off of his face. He looked like he was dead. He had a gray face. He didn't think he was breathing, but he reached down for his carotid artery because he knows that's his training. And he had a pulse, so he knew he was alive. It was a very thready, weak pulse, but he knew that he was alive. So he went into trauma mode. He put his head down, he brushed the snow off, covered him with his jacket, started yelling for help, help.
He took off his own ski jacket and put it over this man.
Both jackets, right. And he said to me he wasn't cold at all because he didn't know why he wasn't cold. Well, later on, when the whole event was over, he was freezing to death, but it was very cold. And he said, during this time, I wasn't cold at all. So he covered him up with his jacket, started yelling for help, and finally someone one of the last skiers coming down the mountain heard his cry and found him. And he said, "What can I do for you?" And he said, "Go down to the, as soon as you can get to the phone or the ski patrol, call the ski patrol and get him up here."
All of which was a miracle, because your description of this blizzard, which came on rapidly, was that you could barely see in front of your own face. Exactly. So for him to be crying out help, it was very unlikely that there was anybody still skiing or could even hear him or see him.
Well, it's another coincidence, Amy. You know that. Just a coincidence that the skier happened to be the last skier down the mountain that heard his voice, you know. So he evidently he went down to the lodge and got the ski patrol. They came up within about 20 minutes. They were up there, loaded the unconscious individual onto a gurney, took him down to the lodge where they had called an ambulance and took him off to the hospital. Steve then was shivering from both adrenaline and also from cold and joined his wife and his wife's sister. They skied down the mountain. They got their reward of hot chocolate. The next day, he called the hospital and said, "How's this guy doing?" And they said, "He's perfectly fine. He's awake. He's not. There's no frostbite. The leg. Steve happened to splint a broken leg in the field with a tree branch and some of his clothes. And he said the orthopedic guys were very impressed with your splinting in the field of the leg. They didn't have to do anything with it. They just kept the bones were aligned right where they should have been." Wow. And so Steve said to me, "If you have an experience like that, you don't believe in something higher than us, you don't know what you believe in." It's interesting, Amy. I thought that was the story. And then Steve said, "Well, that's not the whole story." I said, "Well, what else happened that day?" And he said, "There were 2 people saved that day." And I said, "Well, who was the other person?" And Steve said, 2 years before, when I was skiing with my father in Michigan, I think it was, they were cross-country skiing. His father had a heart attack, arrested, and literally died on the mountain. Steve rushed him to the emergency first aid station where they did CPR for an hour, and he died. Steve is,
Oh, and let me just jump in and say, I'm remembering this, that he carried his father on his back, and his father was a 200-pound man, and he said he didn't even feel the weight, that he made a judgment call that he couldn't wait for an ambulance, that
right,
he needed to go to the closer hospital,
right.
and he did this on foot with his father on his back.
That was an emergency room station where they were equipped with a doctor there, so they did CPR. And Steve is a pretty strong guy. He claims that he can do 1,000 push-ups and 1,000 sit-ups, which I believe he can. So he's very strong.
Mm-hmm.
I can do about 1,000 more than I can do. So they did CPR for an hour, and then his father died. And Steve blamed himself because Steve is an orthopedic surgeon. He's used to saving lives and not losing them. And so he thought it was his fault that his father died, and he had this guilt the whole time. And when he ran across this skier that had been unconscious and he literally saved his life, he thought, this is a second chance. I've got a second chance. And someone upstairs, he said, is giving me a second chance. And so he felt that he was redeemed that day, that he finally realized that his father's death was not his fault, that people live and people die, and that it was his time. And he thinks his father had something to do with the whole experience because, again, he said 2 people were saved that day. I was saved, and the skier was saved, both.
Yes, that's a profound, very beautiful story, that it's not just about miracles, about saving somebody else's life, but always to have the humility to receive the miracle as well. That if we're involved in some kind of synchronicity, a meaningful coincidence that is compelling us to go somewhere or do something, that we discover what the healing or the gift for ourselves is as well.
Agreed, and it's humbling to think that a higher being would call upon us to do His bidding. What an amazing thing that someone else would, a higher power, God, would call upon us to do something for Him, and that was very humbling to Steve also, and humbling to all of us, I'm sure.
Yes.
One of the purposes of the book was to get people to realize, that there are coincidences that happen, but there are times when they're called upon to help someone else, and to listen to those promptings, to listen to those little voices in the back of your head, to go across the street and talk to someone for some reason, or to give someone a couple dollars for a meal, or some whatever it is, that we sometimes are being asked to do something that comes from above.
And that we don't need to understand it. In fact, it's better if we don't try to analyze too deeply, because then we may very well not do whatever it is we're being called to do. And one of the stories about a doctor and his wife, I believe, who were called to Africa. They used to travel the world
Yes.
at times to do some service, and they did not know that they had entered this country at a time when it was having a civil war. Can you tell us that one?
Yeah, Dave Gieser is one of my friends who's an ophthalmologist, and Dave does a lot of lecturing in foreign countries that have very limited education in glaucoma. That's his specialty. So Dave is an interesting guy because not only does he go to these foreign countries, especially Africa, but he found that his lectures were not very well attended. And he didn't know why. And then he was told that these doctors could not literally afford to get to the place where he was lecturing, to stay overnight, and that's why his lectures weren't well attended. So after that, he would take his own personal money and pay for many, many doctors to come to his place, the hotel, wherever it was, and put them up for the night or several nights. And we did that totally anonymously. No one ever knew that. And I'm surprised he let me tell that story. He was visiting a country in Central Africa, and he had finished his lecture one day, and the country, the town was bustling during the day. When he went to the hotel, people were all over the place, cars and so forth. And when he left the hotel, he was a little bit on the late side. It was probably just after dinner. And when he got with his driver, the driver started to drive the bus that he was on very, very rapidly. And The eerie thing was in the town, there were no people, no cars. It was totally like a ghost town. He thought that was a little strange. They said, why? He asked the driver, why are you going so fast and why aren't people around the town? And the driver said, well, there's a civil war right now and the rebels come down from the mountains at night and they shoot anything that's moving in the city. So his wife suddenly developed a pale face and said, let's keep your pedal to the metal here. And let's go.
Pedal to the metal.
They weren't shot, but that was pretty alarming situation when they realized that they were the only ones on the street and the rebels were coming down from the mountains. So,
yeah, and you think of an ophthalmologist as living, a pretty unadventurous life. So it's really admirable and inspiring to hear about this. And if he had known beforehand, he may have walked into danger himself, but he probably wouldn't have brought his wife into it. So again, this was really divine intervention, you might say.
I think it was.
Also, I want to thank him for telling you that he did pay to help doctors attend his lectures, not for the glory of it, but because it encourages us to be generous and, to realize that it's an investment in whatever God-given project we're feeling called to do. Sometimes we also have to stick our hand in our pocket.
Yes. I think there's a thing called a butterfly effect. You've probably read that book, A Butterfly Effect. And I think the more good we do in the world, the more good that it generates. So I think if we're helping someone else, they're more willing to help someone else. And I think that goodwill spreads exponentially. And so I think that's what he was thinking about too, that he's doing some goodwill there, and those people are going to help other people with their eye problems, and those people then are going to be grateful and help someone else. So
exactly. A Course in Miracles it says there's a spiritual law that giving is receiving, and that the human law would say that, giving is losing something and receiving is getting something. But the spiritual law is giving is receiving. And so you may not receive back from the person you gave to, but there's no doubt that if you give unconditionally, that you've just aligned with the abundant force that is our true nature.
Well, I think when you look at some of the studies that have been done, people that are giving are happier people. They live longer, they're happier people, because I think there's a blessing in giving, and that is whenever you do something good for someone, you feel good yourself. I think we all have experienced that. If we help someone out, you come away, if you have, and one of the things I tell my patients sometimes is when they're facing some serious problems and so forth, give to someone else, give yourself and find someone else that's in trouble and help them. And invariably, they will be helped themselves, even more than the person that they're helping. And that's always true, I think.
Yeah, and I found that at home in a domestic partnership, that in that moment when I feel that I'm the one who really needs to receive understanding from my partner, that if I somehow can switch over and give understanding, that is a very powerful revelation.
I think it is. I think it applies to all of us all the time.
Yeah, it's tough to do, but that's why we're here, to encourage each other.
I think it is. I think it's one of the purposes of our lives, to provide service to others.
So I want to ask you about one of your own stories. I think you have one about a woman who had asthma.
Yes. Interesting story. And that also goes along with what we talked about before about being quiet. And that was quite a difficult thing for me to be quiet for that length of time. But what happened was my partner admitted one of his patients to the hospital. It was interesting that he did that because she was in the ER. It was a Friday night. And the ER doc said, I think she's okay to go home. And my partner said, no, it sounds like she's a little sick. Maybe we should keep her. Now, he was leaving on vacation that night. So he didn't want to go to the emergency room, see her, and then go home and tell his wife why he was so late. You know how that goes. But he had this feeling that he needed to admit her to the hospital. And he did. He went to see her. He admitted her to the hospital. And she had an asthma attack. She had been living with her daughter who had dogs and cats and was a smoker, and she was exposed to all these potential allergens that she is allergic to, and developed an asthma attack. And that was pretty understandable. And so she was in the hospital. I saw her the next day on a Saturday because I was covering for him on the weekend, and she looked like she was doing reasonably well. So I cut down some of her medications, and I thought, well, I'll see how she does the next day. The next day, she was actually worse. And so I thought I was kicking myself for cutting things down and thinking to myself, why did I do this? I shouldn't have cut her medications down. And when I went in to see her, she was on the phone. Now, most patients that are on the phone, usually, and I hate to say this, but it's nice to have, they see the doctor coming in and they say, oh, the doctor's here, I need to hang up, So that's wonderful for me. It saves me some time, but she didn't this time. And I wasn't offended or anything. And she stayed on the phone for a little bit. And I sat down just to wait till she was finished with her phone call. And I was a little uncomfortable because I'm sitting there not knowing quite what to do with my hands, or, I'm kind of fidgeting around. And all of a sudden she became silent. And I'm thinking, what's going on here? And the silence can be very, it can make you very nervous when it's just silence in a room. And I didn't know what to do. And again, I'm sitting there fidgeting and trying to look the other way and putting my hands underneath my feet, my legs, and then I began to think about things, and I began to think, maybe I wonder if she really does have asthma. I wonder if there's something else that she could have, and I wonder if we should be looking for something else. It was a strange series of thoughts that went through my head. And finally, after the longest time, it was probably no more than 3 minutes, but it seemed like the longest time, she hung up the phone. And then I examined her, and I went back to the nurse's station, and I thought, I'm going to order some tests to make sure that that's what she has, that she really has asthma, there's nothing else going on. And one of the tests I ordered is a thing called the D-dimer. It's a blood test. And it measures the breakdown product of blood clots. And if a person has blood clots, the D-dimer is high. Well, I got a call about an hour later. Her D-dimer was very positive. Our normal was about 300 and hers was 1,800. Mm. Oh my goodness, she needs an emergency lung scan. Well, we did an emergency lung scan and it showed blood clots. It wasn't asthma at all. She had multiple pulmonary emboli. She'd had a surgery about 6 months before. Had been suffering probably from pulmonary emboli for a while. And this finally got worse and worse. And it's a life-threatening situation when a person has a blood clot in their lungs. One more can lead to death. So it was a good thing that we'd made the diagnosis. I put her right in the step-down unit, put her on some blood thinner, and after a couple of days, she was literally fine. And when I called her up after I got the report on the D-dimer, I said, Sharon, I want to let you know that I don't think you have asthma anymore. I think it's blood clots. And she said, oh, that's because of the prayer. And I said, what prayer? And she said, well, you were sitting there very uncomfortably. She noticed how uncomfortable I was. She said, my minister was on the phone and he was praying for me. And this prayer was that you would find the cause of my illness, because I knew I was getting worse. And he prayed that you would know right then what I had. And sure enough, whether it was a coincidence or not, you can decide for yourself. That's exactly what I was thinking about, doing something else. And that's when I ordered the D-dimer and found the exact cause of what was wrong with her. And she said, I know that's the prayer. That was a three-way conversation with heaven.
Yes.
And so that was kind of a moving story for me. And
very, especially since you were kicking yourself at first.
Yes.
That you had slightly lowered the dosage of her medication.
Right.
And there's that tendency, I think, in a good doctor to take responsibility for that and, look more closely. And then your willingness to be uncomfortable and tolerate the silence. Again, as a psychotherapist, I really appreciate that you were willing to do that, and that you didn't find it a waste of time. And in giving the space, these thoughts came to you.
Yes. Yeah. It was very uncomfortable. I wanted to leave the room. I wanted to do something, but I didn't want to embarrass her by leaving the room when she was on the phone. But I'm sitting there as squirming around and uncomfortable. But I think obviously it was all for a reason. And it was just amazing to me to hear that revelation happen right when she was on the phone.
Now, does that affect you, the way that you practice? Do you find that you take a moment to ask for guidance, or do these things just occur spontaneously and you trust them more?
It's all of the above. It's all of the above. writing this book has caused me to be more aware of another side of medicine, and that's the spiritual side of medicine. And that's what I was hoping to get to doctors and also patients, to realize that there's something else. And so I still do the same things I always do. I try to practice reasonable medicine, order the right tests, and so forth. But I pay more attention to the little hints and little things that are in the back of my head. And my partner is particularly aware of this too, Dr. Boren, who tells me that he always listens to that little voice in the back of his head. And when he hears that, he pays attention to what that is. And it says it's never let him down. He actually has had a couple cases where he had the little voice and it said, do a stress test on one of the individuals he was pre-oping. And he didn't have a great indication to do that, but he listened to that little voice, and sure enough, the stress test was abnormal. The fellow had bad coronary disease, probably would have died in surgery, and but ended up with a bypass before his surgical procedure, so that probably saved his life. So,
do you think there's the possibility, I know this is so unlikely, but in the future, that a course on intuition or the spiritual side of medicine, as you put it, could be taught in medical school?
I think it will be. I think it will be. I think more and more doctors are recognizing these kinds of events that happen. So I'm convinced it will be part. There'll be some medical schools that won't ever do that, but there are some medical schools I think that will. And I think it'd be valuable to do that. I think these kinds of things happen. And I've talked to lots of doctors, over 200 doctors, and the majority of them have had some strange, interesting experience that most of them are not willing to talk about very much. But again, the ones that were, I was able to put in the book.
Actually, you would not even have gotten into medical school if it were not for a spiritual experience. Could you share that with us?
It's very true. I was an economics major in college because I switched over from pre-med to economics when I went to a class that I just hated. And one of the students was sitting there at the bench looking at me and saying, "Isn't this class wonderful? This is exactly what medical school is going to be all about." And I almost threw up on the spot. And
was that dissecting frogs?
This was embryology, where you looked at 1,000 slides of an embryo of a mouse or something. It was just an amazing, boring class. And so I thought, the next day I became an economist. So I was in economics. And so I graduated, and I thought, this is wonderful. I never liked school very much, so I could just not have to go to school ever again in my life. Well, after about a year, I realized I made a huge mistake. I wanted to go back into medicine. I started to take classes and courses, and one of the last classes I needed to take was organic chemistry. And I had another year to do this. I needed to get into organic chemistry this particular year because I had a family by this point. I needed to get a job and do a regular kind of living to support my family. So I gave myself one more year to get into medical school, and that would be the prerequisite was organic chemistry. So fortunately, I was going to school. It was a night class. I was working in Aurora at the time, which is where the class was offered. And I thought, this is great. I'll just go from my job to the school, Aurora University. And I went to the bookstore, bought one book. There were about 30 or 40 books on the shelves, kind of falling off the shelves. There were so many books. And I thought, this is great. It's going to be a big class. And I went to the class, and there were 3 students in the class at night. And I thought, well, this is even better because I'll get personal attention, until the professor walked in and said, "I'm sorry, but we have no one in the class. We've got only 3 students in this class. We're going to cancel the class for lack of attendance." And my heart sunk. I thought, my life is over. I'll never become a doctor because I needed this class. And I realized one other school offered organic chemistry at night, and it was Roosevelt University, 75 miles away in downtown Chicago. So the next day, I made a lame excuse to my boss, and I ran down to Roosevelt to enroll. And I got in line, and the next class was starting the next day. And I got to the front of the line, and I said to the registrar, "I'd like to enroll in organic chemistry." And she said, "Oh, I'm very sorry. We have one full class. The next class we opened up just to accommodate lots of people like you, and now we have 10 on the waiting list, so there's no room." And I said, "Well, you don't understand. This is my life flashing in front of me here. I need to get into organic chemistry. Otherwise, I won't be a doctor. I'll be a failure in life," and so forth. And she said, "I'm sorry. The 10 students that are on the waiting list have exactly the same story that you do." And I was desperate. And I said, "Well, who makes the ultimate decision about who gets into this class?" And she said, "Well, the professors do." And I said, "Well, where can I find the professors?" said, up to room 302 upstairs. So I ran up the stairs, stumbling half the time. I got to a room that was full of students, I think with the same idea that I had, trying to talk with the professor. And I must have looked like the worst sad person in the world to the secretary. And I said, if I can just have 1 minute of the professor's time. She said, okay, go into the anteroom in front of all these other students that gave me a bad look when I did that, and sit on a chair right in front of where the professors are meeting in their class, in their office. So I did. I sat there. The door was paper thin, and I could hear their conversation. The one professor said to the other one, I don't know what we're going to do. We've checked with the publisher. We've checked with all the universities around. No one has any organic chemistry books. We've had a whole class with no books. I don't know what we can do. It starts tomorrow. And they said, this is a really serious problem. I don't know what we're going to do. And they finally had another conversation. Then one professor stepped out, and the professor that was in the room signaled for me to come in and shook my hand and looked very boring because I think he knew what I was going to say. And I said, I need to get into organic chemistry and I will be a failure in life if I don't, and so forth. He said, we've got another full class. We've got 10 people on the waiting list. I'm very sorry. I just can't let you in the class. And so my heart sunk and I didn't know quite what to do, but it was a desperate situation. I finally had a flash of brilliance and I said, if I can get you the books, will you let me in the class? And all of a sudden his eyebrows went up. He looked like he was suddenly interested in me. And there was a long silence again. I didn't say anything, thinking, I've got to let him speak next. And he finally said to me, can you get me 30? And my heart by this point was up in my throat, beating. I said to him, more. And there was another long silence. And he said, you're in. So
wow.
I got into organic chemistry. I passed the class. He got the books because I told him where the books were. There were enough books for all the second class. And I was thinking, and before I wrote my book, I thought this was an interesting coincidence that I would happen to be sitting right in the place where they were talking about what they needed, and only I could help them, and only they could help me. And what are the odds that would happen? I thought that was just one of those interesting coincidences. Well, it wasn't a coincidence at all. The likelihood of that is almost infinitesimal. And so I think that was the hand of God leading me to that particular place, so I could take organic chemistry, so I could then get into medical school and pursue my career. And,
yes, your career began with the touch of God, and you were willing to show up even though you had to take off some time from work, even though your wife was going to support you for a while, even though you had a very long drive to Chicago to go to this class weekly. Was it every week?
I was several times a night, three nights a week.
3 nights a week.
Yeah,
and even though you felt desperate, you were still persistent. So you still asked, can I find the teacher? Can I walk upstairs? Can I enter the classroom? And somehow out of that desperation and willingness to show up and persist, this inspiration, again, divine intervention, it just popped into your head to put 2 and 2 together with they need books and I know where there are books.
Yes. Yeah. I think when miracles happen, in many cases, it's because we work at pursuing something that is worthwhile. And it may require a lot of our effort. And then I think we're helped along the way. Steve Jobs had an interesting comment. Did you ever hear his speech at Stanford when he talked in 2005?
Yes.
He talked about that. And he talked about going to a school that was very expensive. He said almost as expensive as Stanford. And when I was there, I realized my poor parents, who were just factory workers, could hardly afford that, and I wasn't getting anything out of it. So he dropped out. Mm-hmm. He said, when I dropped out, I was able to attend classes that I never would have attended before, like calligraphy and a few things like that. And he realized, in retrospect, that those were the classes that helped him design a wonderful font and a computer system that otherwise he wouldn't have been able to do. And he said, when you look back in retrospect, you will frequently see things that you were guided to do that you never realized, but you can only tell that in retrospect. You can't tell it when you're doing it. And so that's many of the stories in my book illustrate that too, that if you look back in retrospect, you will see things that you've been guided to do that you never thought that you were guided to do at all. And
yes. And it's comforting to think that doctors may see this and feel more willing to rely on their intuition and to pay attention to that small voice that seems to be in the background. Mm-hmm. And also the rest of us who are patients, I'm sure we would love to have doctors like you and the ones you're describing Do you think that there's any way to make it more likely to get yourself a doctor who is willing to receive spiritual guidance as part of his care?
Um, I'm hopeful that books like mine and many others that are coming out will make their way to doctors and patients and encourage more spiritual guidance and spiritual talk among patients and doctors. And I think there's lots of research going on about things like prayer and the benefits of prayer, and how when you pray for someone, they may actually do better than someone that's not being prayed for. So there's lots of research in this area. And I think, again, medical schools at some point may have some courses on these kinds of things too. It's becoming more mainstream.
So it's well worth praying to get a doctor who's well matched, well suited to what you need as a patient.
Absolutely, absolutely. In my book, there were many situations where prayer was incredibly helpful.
Do you want to share one of those stories?
Sure, sure. Um, the story I'll share is about the same individual that had the experience in Africa, Dave Geezer, who is now chairman of the board of Wheaton College. So he's involved with a very spiritual university college. And he said that when he was in high school, he was playing soccer. He was the goalie, and one day he was being overly aggressive and charged the forward that was ready to kick the ball. And as he charged and fell against the ball, the forward couldn't help himself, but he kicked David right in the flank and ruptured his kidney when he kicked him. And when he did that, David had the most excruciating pain he had in his life, he said. And he hobbled home. His mother, I should say, took him right to the hospital. They discovered that he had a ruptured kidney and he was urinating blood. He was in extreme pain. He could hardly do anything. He said during the day he couldn't even watch TV. He was in so much pain. He could just sit there and watch the clock go around. And this happened on a Tuesday. The urologist that was taking care of him then decided to schedule a surgery to remove his kidney to do a nephrectomy, and that was scheduled for the next week. This was a Friday that he had this. And in the morning, when he was laying in bed in excruciating pain, he was just watching the clock, 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock. Suddenly at 10 o'clock, something happened. The pain seemed to disappear. And he thought, well, it's just because I'm not moving or something. So he decided to move just a little bit to see if the pain was still there. And he moved to the right, and he moved to the left, and there was no pain. He did the monumental effort of sitting up, and he sat up, and there was no pain. And then he decided to get out of bed, and the pain was totally gone. Urinated in the bathroom. There was no blood in his urine. Everything was totally fine. The doctors couldn't believe that. They sent him home the next day because he was totally asymptomatic. He went back to school in about a week or so after he recovered. And when he got back to school, he saw one of his teachers that he was particularly close to. And the teacher said, David, we were very, very worried about you. And we heard that you were going to have a kidney removed that David didn't even know about. We decided to have a faculty prayer. And that was passing hour on Friday. And David said, well, when was passing hour? 10 o'clock. At 10 o'clock, they said the faculty prayer that he would be healed and cured. And at 10 o'clock, his pain was gone. His blood was gone in his urine. And there was no residual damage to the kidney from subsequent x-rays. And he was totally cured.
I have tingles all over. And I've heard many, many stories like this, but they never fail to make me feel a thrill. I guess just that confirmation that there's more than meets the eye, and that we are spiritual beings on a human journey, and that we can have trust in God.
And David said that event changed his life. He became a very spiritual person after that, and he indeed has his whole life. And he's done these crazy things like pay for doctors to come listen to his lectures, because he thinks that that's part of his job in life. And it really is. He's been a great help to millions of people, I'm sure.
It's really great to get the backstory. And it's not like there's always a happy ending physically, but there may be a new kind of peace of mind that takes over if you're on your deathbed, or that somehow can soothe your family members. There can be more of a sense of rightness or closure.
Yes.
If an illness is not working out the way we would hope, not every miracle looks the way we expect it to. Would you agree?
That's very true. I had an experience a couple of years ago where one of my patients ended up where his oncologist practiced at another hospital. So I wasn't seeing him in the hospital. And it was an incredibly busy day. I'll never forget this day. I was like a half hour behind the whole day. Everyone was mad at me for being late, and I was getting calls like crazy. I had about a stack of calls to make, and I wasn't able to catch up with anything, and I was getting more and more behind. And then this individual who was suffering from this cancer and was in another hospital called me up and said, "Doctor, I'd like you to tell me if I'm dying or not." Well, I didn't know whether he was dying or not. I didn't know what his labs were and things like that. So I said, "Well, let me." And I'm thinking, "Oh my gosh, I've got one more thing to do." You know, it wasn't a kind thing to think, but you know, that's in the heat of the battle. You're thinking, oh, "I've got so much to do, and I've got this thing now to check on." So I called his oncologist and I said, "You know, Roger called me. He wants to know whether he is living or going to die or what's going on." And the oncologist said, "Well, his creatinine is like 15. His potassium is very, very high. He's not going to survive another day or two." And I realized that when he told me those numbers. So I called him back and I said, "Roger, I'm very sorry. This is really hard to do over the phone, to tell a person he's going to be dying in the next period." And so I said, "Your numbers are very bad. It doesn't look like you're going to survive this." And he said, "Well, how much longer do you think I have?" And I said, "It's going to be in terms of days and not weeks." And he said, "Thank you," and hung up the phone. And then the next thing I know, I got a death notice. There was a funeral a week from then. He had died a couple of days later. And when I went to the wake, the entire family came up to me and hugged me. And I thought this was very strange. I didn't participate in his care, at the very end. And they said, "Thank you for what you did for him." I said, "What did I do for him?" And they said, "You told him that what he needed to know. You told him that he was dying. He was so anxious and upset that he didn't know whether he was dying or going to live. And when you told him that, he knew what his future was. He called the priest for a last rites. He became very peaceful and quiet, and he became resigned to his fate, and it gave him the most peace that he had the whole time. And thank you for giving him peace for the last 2 days of his life." Huge difference. So even though he didn't have a good result, even though he did die, I think we can all give people peace and happiness and hope through some of the things that we do. So like you said, it's not always a good result, but I think we can make a difference in lots of little things that we do.
I'm so glad you told that story, because it can seem counterintuitive to us that if we deliver bad news, that it could somehow be a comfort or offer something positive. And then it wasn't just him, it was his family who got to witness this altered state that he went into, a peaceful state. And, clearly it's a spiritual state. Do you think also that hormones get affected and produce some kind of flood of peace physiologically, as well as the mysterious?
Well, I'm sure they do. I think hormones are affected by our mental status in many cases. So there are lots of things that would have happened there. And you're right. It was very interesting that the entire family was upset and anxious, and suddenly everyone was calm and peaceful. And they were spiritual, they were religious people. They knew that there was something on the other side, and they knew that he would go to a better place. And so everyone was calmer after that. And it was a really an eye-opener for me, thinking that I told a person he was going to die, and that was the best thing I could have done that day. And probably in the throes of battle, with all the things I had to do, that was the most significant thing I did that whole day, that one little thing.
Even though it initially seemed like one thing too many.
It did, and I felt guilty for thinking that, here's a person who's dying, and I should have paid more attention, or I should have done more, and I was so busy that I felt guilty that I had those feelings. And I think we all feel that in many cases when we have feelings of, looking out for myself versus someone else. But it all turned out well.
Very, very human, to feel guilty about that. And even when we're less than perfect, though, it's nice to know that we could still come through.
Yes. Yeah. I think God, or whatever you want to call that spirit above, relies on imperfect people to do his perfect work.
For sure. Is there anything else that you would like to share with the viewers today? Before we close, I want to make sure that they know the title of the book is Physicians' Untold Stories, and that it's by Dr. Scott Kolbaba. And would you welcome, if people have stories to share, is there a place that they could email them or
Yes,
contact
yes.
you?
It's physiciansuntoldstories.com. And I'm working on a second book, so I'd love to hear other stories. We're working on a physician book, but then it'll be other books will follow. And so I'm open to any stories that anyone has to send to me.
Wonderful. Is there a message that you'd like to leave us with?
Yeah, I think that the kinds of things that I wanted to get through the book are that there is something higher than us. I think that when people realize that, know that they have a happier life, they have more peace, and they have more hope. I think people need to realize that there is a place that we go to beyond this life, and that those that have passed on can sometimes come back and help us in the things that we do in strange and interesting and wonderful ways. I'd like people to be aware, like I became aware, but not until I wrote the book, that coincidences may not be coincidental, that there may be something that guides us, and to pay attention to those little coincidences, and also pay attention to that little voice in the back of your head that says, go talk to that person, or give them a pat on the back, or maybe that person needs something from you, and listen to that little voice, and don't be embarrassed to stick your neck out and to do the things that you may not be comfortable doing. Say something when you're prompted to say something. And so those are the things that I tried to get across in the book, and that I think the butterfly effect is that the more good we do in the world, the more good there will be in the world, and it'll spread exponentially.
Well, it's a very touching book, and I know I felt comforted and inspired by it, and I'm sure everybody who reads it will, and that message will have a ripple effect, just like you're hoping.
Great. Thanks, Amy.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.